Good evening, everyone. Oh, we need to be sure we're still awake after the Thanksgiving dinner. Good evening, everyone. Wonderful to see you all, and I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday. My name is Ebony Nelson. I have the honor and pleasure of serving as dean of this wonderful law school, and on behalf of the University of Connecticut School of Law, faculty, staff, students, and alumni, it is indeed my pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's In Conversation program, discussing the role of the states in preserving democracy. I extend a special welcome to our outstanding participants joining us this evening. Thank you all so much for being with us. We are all very much looking forward to your insights. Want to thank esteemed members of the judiciary and bar and legislatures who's joining us this evening. Tonight's roundtable is part of the law school's In Conversation series that brings together leading scholars, practitioners, experts, and commentators to discuss some of the most pressing legal issues of our day. Tonight, our topic is the role of the states in our political system and the place of states in our nation at this important point in our history. This roundtable is the first event in the law school's initiative to examine and foster new ways of thinking about the role of state institutions, particularly state law schools and universities, in maintaining and fostering democratic values and policies. Before I turn things over to our esteemed panelists and moderator, I'd like to thank all of those who helped to play such a critical role in organizing tonight's event. So, of course, our remarkable Associate Dean for Faculty Development and Intellectual Life, Ann Daly, we thank her, as well as our UConn Law colleagues, Professors Anya Bernstein, Peter Singelman, and Minor Myers for all of their hard work. I would also like to thank our invaluable events, ITS, facilities, and catering departments for their wonderful assistance. Please join me in thanking them all. It is now my honor and privilege to briefly introduce our moderator for this evening. Kyle Brennan Marquez is a professor of law and William T. Golden Scholar here at UConn Law. He is a prolific scholar who writes and teaches in the area of constitutional law, as well as civil procedure, criminal law, evidence, and law and technology. We are so very fortunate to have him with us tonight to facilitate tonight's discussion. Thank you so much for moderating, Professor Brennan Marquez, and thank you all again for joining us for this wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Let me also echo the thanks that Dean Nelson was extending to everyone who contributed to making this event possible. I know a lot goes into this, so I think this is going to be a really fun discussion. We're joined today by a esteemed panel of folks. I'll give you just their names, and you can read about their bios in the program, just so we maximize time for the conversation. But in order, to my left here, we have Tony Darren, who's at the University of Chicago; Julie Murray, who's at the ACLU; Dan Farbman, who's at BC Law; and then Rick Sue, who's at UNC. And all of them, in their ways, have engaged in sort of scholarly and practical, venues on a lot of the questions that we're going to be discussing this evening. So I wanted to sort of start out by just kind of framing the problem very, very briefly, and then asking them each to kind of talk at a somewhat high level about their kind of fundamental impressions of some of this. As Dean Nelson said in her opening remarks, the inspiration for this is really the sense that episodically in American political history, we have these moments where the fundamental relationship between federal power, the center of power in the federal government, and the state governments is kind of raised anew, or the mysteries that are maybe endemic to that relationship, to the kind of grand experiment of our federalist system, are brought back to the surface by political events and really give us an occasion to sort of think about some of the fundamental structures. What's at stake? What's working? What isn't? How is the whole thing supposed to be working? And so on and so forth. And we are at such a moment today. And so that was the kind of big picture inspiration for this, and I'm hoping that we can traverse kind of between the 30,000 foot view and the more granular view with some of the experts that we have the benefit of having on the stage here with us. So with that in mind, I thought that the best maybe opening sort of missive here, question for all of you, and we can just go in sequence and have everybody kind of give their initial take on it to start the conversation, is sort of what does the state or the states mean to you when we have this kind of conversation? So constitutional scholars and lawyers are kind of in the habit, for better or for worse, of sort of treating the states almost monolithically as an abstract category. So we talk about the relationship between federal power on the one hand and the states on the other hand. So a lot of the doctrine, you remember from your classes, is about the basic allocation of power between two poles, the federal pole and the state pole. But of course, the states in reality on the ground mean a whole lot of different things. The states as a category refers to state courts, state legislatures, state administrative agencies. It also refers to a whole lot of stuff that happens on the ground more locally. So municipal governmental departments like police departments and school boards are, as a matter of formal constitutional doctrine, just part of the state. They're kind of folded into the state. But of course, in reality, they can be quite different from state government. They can have a texture and sort of life of their own on the ground. And so the question for all of you to start is just from your particular vantage point, expertise, kind of way of conceptualizing these questions, how do you think of the state or the states? What is the most sort of lucrative way, or what particular perspective do you kind of bring to the table, and then we can, I'm sure there will be disagreements that emerge, and I will bring them out if they don't emerge, and we will have a nice conversation about it. So starting with Tony, please.
Thank you all for having me. When I think of the states, turn itself off. What about now? There we go. When I think of the states, I really think of what it is that states do. And states are the primary implementers of law, that's state law or federal law, but the way they do that is through their state agencies, regardless of whether that state agency is a state attorney general, a state secretary of state, the state environmental protection agency, are actually implementing the law on the ground. And so when I think of what it means to be the state, I think of how the primary engines of law and legal implementation are how the states sort of work through their state agencies. And this is, critically important to understand how it is that law, whether it's federal law or state law, is sort of enforced and makes way on the ground, how the law that our legislators and legislatures are passing is actually implemented and enforced. And this matters regardless of whether you are in support of the incoming administration or any administration, or want to be a countervailing balance to federal power. If you want to be countervailing power, center of balance, it's not going to be enough to simply litigate in federal court. If your state agencies aren't well-funded, well-staffed, and have the legal tools to actually implement the law on the ground. So for example, it might be that an administration loses in federal court on a deregulatory environmental regulation, but if the state agency doesn't have the power, the funding, the ability, the legal tools, the capacity to actually implement that regulation on the ground, it's not going to matter that the deregulatory action was stricken down at the federal level. And this is critically important even if you want to support the incoming administration. The Trump administration wants to sort of get the federal government out of the business of regulating and giving things back to the states, but giving things back to the states often means state agencies. And if those state agencies, again, don't have the funding, capacity, or the ability to enact their sort of positive vision of what law should look like, they're not going to actually be able to support the federal administration either. So when I think about states, I really think about what it is they're doing and how they're doing it and the means through which they're implementing it, which for me is really state agencies.
Julie?
So I come at this question from a bit of a different perspective. As was mentioned before, I'm currently at the American Civil Liberties Union, and we started about a year and a half ago something called the State Supreme Court Initiative within the National ACLU. And the goal of the initiative really is to more systematically think about the role of state courts in protecting and expanding civil liberties. I think anyone who's been in the civil rights field oftentimes comes from a very federal court focus. I think back to law school, and I don't know that I really ever heard state constitutions mentioned other than like, oh yeah, there are like 50 of those, and then moving on. So I am coming at these questions, I think, from the perspective of what can the state courts do that federal courts can't do and never have been able to do? And what can the state courts do, from my vantage point, in the face of an increasingly hostile federal judiciary with respect to civil liberties issues that are at the core of our mission? So I think of the state courts as a key actor. I don't know that I would say they're the most lucrative, but in terms of, thinking about certainly the next 4 years, what we are seeing in the judiciary at the federal level and what is likely to come, it seems to me that the state courts and state Supreme Courts have a very important role to play, both in robustly enforcing their constitutional guarantees, statutory guarantees under state law, and in some circumstances, enforcing limitations on the ability of state and local actors to cooperate with the federal government if that is the kind of political valence that is governing in the state. So, I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but that's my area of focus.
Dan?
Yeah, great. Mic is, that's better. Doing something weird. So I should sort of introduce myself as a historian of local government law and also social movements, which I think informs how I see the states or the sort of questions I have when Kyle poses the question, I think, what is a state? And why do we care? As a native of Connecticut, I can tell you, like, a state is the Yukon Huskies. It was like Nadav Hennefeld on my wall when I was a kid. But what is Connecticut, and why do we care? And how is it different from Massachusetts or Rhode Island, and why do we care? And I think if we start there, we start to have like a slightly more textured answer to this question of what we're talking about when we talk about states, right? So states are, they act in national politics. South Dakota and North Dakota are invented to protect the Republican majority in the Senate in the late 19th century, right? So states exist as a sort of tool to regulate national politics, and they might also be, in some instances, places where people have a kind of feeling together, right? But I live in Massachusetts now, and Western Massachusetts is really different from Eastern Massachusetts. And so if we're asking, what is Massachusetts and why does it matter? It seems weird to say, well, Massachusetts has a Massachusettsness. Whereas if you talk to somebody from Athol, Massachusetts, and you ask them, what do you have to do with Cambridge, where I live? They'll say nothing, absolutely nothing. And so that's where I get to local government, right? So if the question is, what are the places where democracy is happening, where we want to invest faith, power, and energy in a moment when we might not have faith in the national government or be worried about things that are happening at the national level? And this could be true. I mean, it's always a tradition that when your guy loses at the national level, you want to go to the state or local level. But I guess for me, the bigger question is, where do we trust? So where would we want to invest our time and energy in doing democracy? And states are a venue where that might be true, but I guess for my purposes, it seems to me like for most of us, local is a venue where we might really want to have more of a sense of what we care about and why we care about it, where we actually do have interpersonal connections with people, where we're going to school with people, where we have a kind of community that we can build on and do something sort of like in a kind of old-fashioned civic life kind of way. And I think in most cases, states actually aren't that. Unless you're talking about a very small state, we're talking about large groups of people doing things that are kind of mini-federal. Whereas if we're talking about doing democracy at a sort of smaller level, sometimes the states are used as a shorthand for that. But I guess where I begin is thinking, well, maybe it's the local where we really should be thinking about these things. And I'm sure I'll talk more about local government and why I think it matters and why it's not the same as the states, but I'll stop there and let Rick talk.
Yeah, so this is a good follow-up, I think, to what Dan was saying. So when I think about the role of states, given this panel's on the role of states in preserving democracy, what I'm really interested in some ways is the state as a site of democracy. And I think we're hearing that a little bit today, right? So with regard to where do we feel this sort of participatory sort of connection, if you will, it's at the state and local level, right? Many states, judges and sort of jurists are elected, right, and part of the political process. And even agencies, one way, even if they're working closely with the federal government, it's really at the state level where they're most sort of interactive with the local population or the targets of that interaction, where they get that feedback, right, in some way. So in some ways what interests me is states as the site of democracy. But what I've been realizing recently is that there's a paradox to this. Because on the one hand, I feel like the states has certainly gained a lot of power in how we think about essentially their operation in our federal system, either as a resistance or as an enabler to, let's say, federal government policies. They need the states, right? So as a result, states become more important. But I'm not necessarily sure that that importance has actually helped state politics as state politics. And in some ways, what I've been sort of concerned about is how sort of their national prominence of state politics may be actually undermining the democracy aspect of state politics itself, right? Without it being sort of tainted by sort of national political movements. So, you know, not only one locality being different from another, but one state really sort of saying, okay, what is it about us? What is it about our jurisprudence? What is it about what we want to regulate? What is it about what we believe in that's important? So I think there's a little paradox I like to explore there.
Great. One thing that I thought might be kind of useful, sort of keeping all that overview in mind, to talk a little bit about up front here is just what sorts of dynamics we might might be reasonable to expect happening in the next 4 years, specifically along the lines. Well, I guess there's sort of two dimensions to it. One is like, if anyone would like to comment, I think it might be useful for the whole room and for the purposes of our further discussion to just think about it in historical perspective. So like some states are going to be kind of gung-ho in implementation mode as it relates to the incoming, new Trump administration. Some states are going to be gung-ho the other way. Is that just sort of par for the course? Like Dan said, it's like if your candidate loses, you're going to want to kind of refocus your energy and attention as a citizen and as a member of the polity and as a professional on the local and state level. But also we can just expect some kind of hydraulic dynamic here, and that's just how it's always been and arguably maybe how it's supposed to be. Or is there something new going on today or kind of differently radicalized about the dynamic, something like that? That's one dimension. And the second dimension is just that I know in some of the conversations the five of us had in anticipation of this, one interesting thing that came to the surface and that some of you have probably seen, just reading the news, is that the results from November's election were very complicated in terms of the interrelationship between how the Electoral College went in the presidential election and what was going on in a more under-the-hood way in a lot of these states. So you have states that are bright red from an Electoral College perspective also electing, blue governors and whose legislature and courts might tend to run in a more progressive direction. You have the opposite dynamic as well. You have states that are sort of, dark blue in some ways, but then they have regions certainly that are more red, or that they're kind of internal operations like run in a different direction. And so I'm sort of wondering if there are examples that anyone has in mind of the way that those particular dynamics are going to play out. Because we know some states, we could probably list off the top of our head a few states that are going to be pretty fervently resistant to the new administration and some that are going to be pretty fervently in implementation mode. But that's really only a handful of states here and there, and there's 50 of them. So in any case, would anyone like to jump in? Dan?
I guess I'll say a couple things. It's really useful sort of focusing. To the historical point, I think I would just make the following observation as someone who writes a lot about the 1850s. I do think there is a hydraulic, I think there is a normal kind of, in every instance when your party loses at the national level, you seek out power or influence in other locations where you can, right? So there's a kind of normal politics around that. I do think that what we're observing now is different, not so much categorically different, but different in scale. And it's different in scale, I think, because the guardrails of that normal hydraulic pattern were a kind of political settlement. So there was a mid-20th century political settlement that maybe ran all the way up to Obama's first term or something like that, where the actual movement back and forth was less extreme. But in moments when that political settlement breaks down and when we don't necessarily know what the rules are, I think you see the same hydraulic movement but with more extremes. So for instance, in the 1850s, states simply refusing to implement the fugitive slave law in the 1850s in the North, making it basically impossible to enforce the law, even though the federal government was essentially creating a federal police force to enforce the law. That was an extreme act of resistance from local governments, actually more than state governments. It wasn't different in kind, but it was different in degree. So that's one thing. The second thing I'd say, just in terms of the location and how we understand the weirdnesses of these results, I think that's partly about sort of what I began with. Where is our politics least alienated from us, right? And so we might ask the question, like, what do I want in the abstract? Well, I might want blue or red in the abstract. But what do I want in the specific? Well, in some extremely blue towns in Massachusetts, they want to make sure that their schools remain rich and largely unintegrated, right? So they might vote blue at the top of the ticket, but they'll vote for pretty restrictionist, anti-redistributive politics locally. By the same token, in St. Louis, although St. Louis is run by, Missouri is run red, people in St. Louis have different senses of what they want. So I actually think it's pretty normal to think that people, when they actually know what they want, when they actually have specific investments in their politics, will vote in more nuanced, thoughtful ways. And part of the problem with our national electoral system is that it drains these decisions of nuance. So we don't get that sense of what do I actually want? We get team playing. And that's it. So just to bring it back to where I began, I think that's a risk at the state level too. You can get team playing in state level politics, which looks really different from the kind of more invested, nuanced, detailed kind of politics that can happen at the local level, where actually you're voting about bike lanes or voting about, whether we should build the park. And in some ways, those are things that we can have real disagreements about that aren't abstract and are specific and maybe more healthy.
Sort of follow up on that a little bit with a question and then and also a comment. So I guess the question is sort of interesting is, we know each other well. We've sort of worked in similar areas. So there's certainly a lot of sympathies in talking about both localities and states as essentially the site in which the context is closest, right? So the bureaucracy is supposedly the most robust. But also what I'm also wrestling with at the same time, and not just in the world of politics, really in the world of culture, is the fact that we're also increasingly, I think, living in a world where our sort of immediate physical present context seems to matter less, right? That even our political context seems to be more in some sort of social media zeitgeist, sort of circle, and maybe we're not seeing as much of this dynamic. Now, I'm with you in the sense that the more that I feel like we can pull it back to a context that matters, that is important, but I also feel like that's more urgent now in a world where I feel like, and this is what I was sort of talking about a little bit before, because I feel like there's a lot of democracy working, but it gets filtered through these sort of national, sort of, sort of meme-ish kind of sort of environments. And as much as, in some ways, I feel that my state or local representatives are more responsive, I feel in some ways they're feeling a lot more pressure from national political movements and national political parties. That in some ways the agendas, in some ways, right, is essentially that we are the second string bench to national politics, as opposed to that we are an important site in and of itself. Now, going back, I think what you said a little bit earlier, Kyle, to what we see the dynamic, I guess there's sort of two ways. I will say historically, what I've been thinking about recently, I was just thinking about this, I was like, okay, what's the historical context, right? Because I knew Dan was going to do that. And I was like, in some ways, this idea of resistance enabling, like this goes all the way back to the Alien and Sedition Act, right? Like this was like right at the founding of our country, right? When like Jefferson and Madison, out of power, goes back and says, you Federalists that passed this bill, we solely sort of disagree with it. So in some ways, this kind of like we retreat to the states as sort of a resistance format has been with us since the founding fathers, right? They sort of set that model. I also thought it was funny because the Alien Sedition Act was essentially all about immigrants and attacking the press, and I feel like we've kind of gone like we're just right back full circle in that way. But what that got me thinking about in terms of the dynamic going forward is in some ways, so one of the areas I do study is immigration, but really the state's role in thinking about immigration. I think one thing that's interesting is that we've been emphasizing immigration as essentially a national issue, always talking about it in sort of these abstract terms. But what we've been missing a little bit, I think all parties, is essentially how immigration really sort of affects in a context, in a community, in a particular area, right? Immigrants not as sort of this general amorphous thing, but you often see that the politics looks different when it's about your neighbors or people you're used to or whatnot, right? Like how people talked about Springfield is very different how Springfield, mayors talked about their own community in some ways. But what also I think got me interested in this as well is that in some ways, how it plays out has always been, even though it's a national issue, dependent on the states. There's no way that we're going to be able to pull off a mass deportation program without substantial state support. But one might also say that one of the failures of the Biden administration is that when they essentially initiated their asylum program, they also didn't get state support with regard to the settlement and the sort of integration. And right as a result, then Texas and Florida was able to sort of direct that in a political avenue. So it's interesting to note that on both sides, they do need the states, but in some ways, how they're actually sort of working with them seems to be very unsettled, and we'll see how that sort of plays out, I think.
Julie, Tony?
I think one way that it's perhaps different, and maybe it's since Obama's first term, is the sense of states' self in the role of either pushing back or enabling the federal government, in the sense that you see blue states attorney generals now already ramping up, thinking about looking through Project 2025 or whatever it is, how they can play an active role in sort of the litigation metric of enforcing or resisting against federal law. And I'm not sure that that was the same 25 years ago. There's always been states attorney generals. There's always been states' roles in federal implementation. But I think as sort of a site of actual engagement with federal politics in this realm, I think is something new. And I think to Rick's point earlier, it has this sort of perverse effect where if the focus is so strongly on what can we do in the federal realm and we're not looking internally, whether that's to local governments or below, I think it sort of does a disservice to all the good work that states do on the ground for bike lanes or communities with immigration or something like that. And so I think that's something that's really changed in the last, 20, 25 years. So the sense of a state and having this active role in what it means to be a state vis-a-vis federal power, I think is really different than what it's been, and those dynamics sort of are continuing to play out.
So in my view, for the coming 4 years, what I would think you are going to see in state courts, or what I hope we will see in state courts, are a few things. One, an attempt by state courts, to more robustly interpret their own state constitutions, to adopt a stance of the primacy of state law, so looking first to whether constitutional rights exist under state law before, or potentially in lieu of, looking at whether any federal rights exist. The practical effect of doing that is that it insulates decisions from U.S. Supreme Court review. But I also think that for people of any sort of political, ideological stripe, the idea that state courts play this independent role from the federal judiciary and have the ability to look at issues anew is good for democracy. And I also, hope that we see state courts playing more of a role in enforcing some of the guardrails for democracy or the processes on which democracy is based. So, I think one practical example of this is in the context of gerrymandering. The U.S. Supreme Court has said basically political gerrymandering is, we don't do that here, go to the States. And so people have done that, and I think, what we are seeing now in the voting rights context is very much a focus on the very different constitutional protections for voting and elections in state constitutions, and the potential protections that they can offer against partisan gerrymandering. The other thing that I'll just say in terms of history is that I do think when you look at some of the more recent, not going back to the 1850s, but let's stick to the 1900s. If you look at some of the more, recent changes in federal law, a lot of those had their beginnings in state courts and state constitutional law. So marriage equality years before, you had a U.S. Supreme Court ruling on that. State courts were dealing with these issues of marriage equality and relying on very different sort of theories, approaches to the issue, but really laying out a framework that the federal decision sort of built upon. I think that also happened in the forced sterilization context. A lot of the resistance to that played out in state courts, not federal. So I do think that we could see that in state courts in the coming years, in part to kind of build a foundation for a different approach than we are likely to see at the federal judiciary.
To make another maybe annoying historian's note, there is actually, I think oftentimes the story Julie's telling is pitted against an idea that the federal constitution, the federal courts or the federal constitution is somehow an obstacle or hostile to this. But just the actual drafting of the 14th Amendment, one of the things it required was that the Confederate States go back and write new constitutions. And they all did. In 1868, they had to write new constitutions that were actually written by radical, oftentimes racially egalitarian. They were progressive in all kinds of ways. The white supremacists hated them, and they wound up changing them throughout the 19th century. But there is actually within the Constitution a grant of authority to states to write good constitutions that are more egalitarian, more protective of rights than the federal courts would be. And so you can, it's not, you can see them as pitted against each other, but I think the history suggests that actually the idea that states should be a venue for these kinds of lawsuits, these kinds of claims, makes perfect sense, and the state's constitution should be liberatory makes perfect sense.
Yeah, just add on a little to what Julie was saying before. I think the experimentation point is really important with regard to states trying out different things that we get ideas from, and not only in state courts. I remember having a conversation with one of my friends recently, and this is the whole, to the point I think about how we talk about politics now, but we were sort of talking about, you have all these like Portland or Oregon or California adopting all these crazy liberal policies, and look, the voters now are sort of pulling back, right? But sort of suggesting that as some sort of like, this is the problem with states. And I was like, no, that's democracy working, right? We have an idea, we try it, we're like, maybe that didn't work, we tweak it, right? There's this idea that what I saw actually as part of this experience of experimentation, right, where you have the ability to do so, was actually being seen or sort of lambasted as some sort of mistake that was made. So that's both, I think, in some ways, one thing that was sort of interesting in thinking about the role of states, but also raises a concern. Because in some ways, I think not only do states have more authority and sort of power in a lot of federal politics, but they're also now part of the political football, right? It's now actually in federal elections to campaign against or in favor of a particular state has become sort of much more popular than even against necessarily some sort of national policy. So I'm afraid of what's going on there is that essentially the too much spotlight can also then keep this experimentation from happening, right? This sense that we are all aligned, and really what we're really talking underneath all of this is sort of the partisanship that overlays the federal system, is whether or not that partisanship is going to sort of constrain the type of experimentation or different sort of tailoring of different policies to different states because they feel like this is going to affect some sort of national dynamic, when what we should be doing is actually promoting some of that and letting that sort of work out before having this kind of extreme backlash at the national level. I did want to throw out two things, right, which is interesting based on the conversation. So one thing, of course, is the fact that state constitutions, especially with ballot initiatives, are much more often amended these days, right? So how does sort of democracy in the ballot initiative world look like, you know, in thinking about sort of state constitutions as a new role? So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there.
Actually, just had a question for Julie. I mean, I'm all for state courts being more protective of rights. My concern, my worry is because of the ballot initiative, spent a lot of time in Colorado and other places out west, the voters just go and reverse it, right? And so there's always this tug and pull. Like the beautiful part, the nice part about a federal constitutional right is that it applies everywhere. It's hard to amend. And so I'm just curious how you think about that sort of, how to think about that sort of, that struggle between how protective, how much in the light do we want certain state constitutional rights to be versus voters sort of going the other direction, or even completely reworking a constitution. I think it's been probably since the 80s since a state constitutional convention has been called, but states used to call constitutional conventions all the time, and they're really fun to read. Like everything is on the table. I mean, the complete structure of the government, how votes are counted, which rights are on the table. And my like own personal concern is the more we focus on states too much, the more we get to these state constitutional conventions and we start to lose some stuff. I'm just curious how you think through those sort of dynamics and concerns, and just tell me I'm worrying for nothing.
I don't think you're worrying for nothing. I mean, you know, look, the past few years, we've certainly seen state courts that have, for lack of a better word, flip-flopped on issues very close in time to the earlier decision. You know, and you can see that with constitutional amendments as well. I mean, of course, not all states have citizen-initiated ballot processes, so but, you know, to the extent that state courts issue a ruling and the voters say that's not in alignment with our values, and they vote for something different, to me that's democracy, right? And the ability of voters to, in those states with citizen-initiated ballot processes, to go around oftentimes very gerrymandered legislatures to enact something that is closer to the will of the people, to me that seems like a good thing. I also think, you know, from the perspective of a civil rights litigator, I do think that there is, litigating constitutional rights at the state level is just different in a number of ways, but one of them is that, you know, at the federal level, I think we often think of it as like, well, that question's been settled by the federal courts, and unless the federal courts just, you know, upend stare decisis or change in a radical way, that question is settled. There's no real possibility or likelihood of constitutional amendment. And thinking about the process of protecting democracy at the state level, there actually is much more of a dynamic way for citizens to participate. So maybe it's electing their judges, maybe it's voting on changes to the Constitution, maybe it's adopting local policies that are more protective than state and certainly federal law. And, you know, ultimately, sometimes voting people out of the bench or off the bench when they don't like decisions. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that it is just a different animal. And there are more levers for the public to show, you know, what they think about particular issues and what their values are in their particular state.
I was going to ask just one more question, and then we'll open it up to the group. I'm wondering, because we're sort of circling around this theme in some respects, so I'll explicate it, which is, are there any forms of resistance at the state level that are plausible, that we can anticipate actually happening, even if they're not necessarily going to happen, but they're non-fanciful, that would be best described, in any of your views, as just anti-democratic? So, you know, we can, one might draw a distinction, for example, between the state courts kind of elaborating rights in the vacuum left by the federal judiciary, like the gerrymandering example is a very clean instance of, the federal judiciary basically said, as Julie, rightly summarized it, look, this isn't really for us. We're stepping out. It's a political question. We're formalizing the idea that it's not even for us. It's for you guys. So, but even when the federal courts aren't quite as explicit as that, there's a sense in which any time they retrench a rights regime, there's an opportunity for state courts to sort of step in and fill the vacuum. That feels uncontroversial. Like, I can't really imagine the theory of constitutional democracy that sees that as a formal matter, as a problem. That just, you might disagree with certain conclusions or whatever, but that just seems like the system working, right? When we're talking about state governments, whether at the local level or at the state level or both, doing things like preparing in advance to resist as robustly as they possibly can. Like, I'll just tell one sort of story from my own life. A friend of mine from law school, a classmate, just became the Solicitor General of Idaho, and I was looking him up, and it was like, oh, congratulations. And on their website, when you look it up, it just says, like, Idaho Solicitor General's office, like, doing everything we can to resist the Biden administration at every turn. That's like the public website that they've made in Idaho. And so are there things like that we should at least entertain the possibility that they're anti-democratic? Or do we have an idea of democracy that makes so much room for experimentation and pluralism at its core that actually all of it is kind of pro-democratic in some sense? That would be the question.
So I absolutely agree. I mean, this is kind of the concern that I raised a little bit in the beginning. So let me give you the specifics, right? I think it was mentioned a little bit. I think the fact that essentially attorney generals have turned into essentially just intergovernmental litigators, right? That essentially the role of pretty much every attorney general is essentially to sue the federal government, and then we flip the administration, it's a different set of attorney generals, and they're all going to get prepped to sue the federal government. I think there are grounds to sue the federal government. I think there are grounds for attorney generals representing their state to sue the federal government. I'm not entirely sure this new posture that seems to be much more focused on essentially the partisan valence is actually the role. I think there are a lot of organizations, there's a lot of people, there's no shortage of people out there that want to sue the federal government. Like, that's just going to happen. So I'm not like, oh, if we don't have attorney generals doing it, then no one's going to do it. I think plenty of people do it. I'm sure the ACLU will be happy to do it. There are other people that do it. But I feel like there is this dynamic, and it's not just the attorney general. I think I'm hearing it increasingly from even our state legislatures, right? There's sort of certain legislatures expressing the sense that even their sort of consensus or understanding of how North Carolina legislature work is now getting a lot of pressure from other out-of-state sort of forces on these are the issues you should be focusing on. I think there's a sense where it used to be, and I've taught for quite a while, but it used to be that I could say, if you want some sense of, sort of executive leadership, you got to look to the governors because they have to keep the train running. But now every governor is running for president. So essentially they're all like just sort of, a sort of national figures and trying to sort of get on that thing. Now, I have nothing wrong with those actions if I do think that they are truly, regardless of what side you're on, in the best interest of their state. But I feel like so much of it now is driven by essentially national politics and getting that sense. So the institutions of state politics are there. Like Julie says, there are so many people we elect at the local level, right? Our prosecutors. We don't elect the U.S. attorney, right? We don't even elect the attorney general. We elect our attorney general on the state level. There's so many opportunities that we can essentially tailor our state governments. But in some ways, I feel like whatever decision we've made, we've turned them essentially into appendages of fighting some sort of national partisan fight. So I feel like the role that they could serve is not being served. So that's my concern. I think a lot of it is being used for that purpose.
Dan?
I mean, at the risk of being overly academic, it really depends on what you mean by democracy. Maybe if I append man to that, it sounds more informal, right? Like, it depends on what you mean by democracy, man. So, like, I suspect that if we took a poll in this room, everybody would say, and it's like, thumbs up, thumbs down, do you like democracy? Everybody would put their thumbs up, right? It has not yet become, although, maybe there's some of you who are, it's a republic, not a democracy. That distinction makes no sense. We can talk about that if you want. But there is, so much depends upon, I guess what the short answer to this is, I think there is a defense to be made of all of these kinds of decisions from the position of democracy. So let's take, for instance, the ballot initiative, right? So I actually don't like ballot initiatives. Derek Bell has a great article about ballot initiatives basically saying they're garbage. They're anti-democratic. Why? Because they allow for a kind of binary decision about a complex thing that can be where you can pour money into one side or the other side, and you get a bunch of people to vote yes or no on something, and you make policy around something in a way that's not actually the kind of policy. It's not actually thoughtful. It's not nuanced. Is it democratic? I would never argue that a ballot initiative is not democratic. Of course it's democratic. It's majoritarian. Is it the kind of democracy I like? No. Right? And I think that's oftentimes what we're seeing when we're talking about this. So, like, another place that you see this is in issues of preemption. In red states with blue cities, the red states preempt the actions of blue cities all the time. Is it anti-democratic to do so? Well, no. Of course, the red states have the authority to preempt the blue cities. Is it also true that the blue cities have democratic authority to maybe? So it's about whose voice are you interested in listening to, and when, and what varieties, what venues of democracy do you have faith in, and which one do you not have faith in? So I actually don't think it's helpful to say, is it anti-democratic? I think it's rather helpful to be more specific in our own minds and to have the conversation, what kind of democracy do we like, right? What kinds of civic life do we want to lift up? Whose voices do we want to listen to, and how? And if you're asking those questions, then I think in each of these instances that you posit, we'll have different people fighting against each other, and you might trust one form of civic life more than another, one set of democratic decisions more than another, for reasons that we'd have to try to fight about and articulate, but I do think we could have that conversation.
I'm probably going to answer this question more from just a practical perspective, like what am I worried about? To me, what we have seen in the past, certainly 8 years, makes me concerned about the ability to hold the line on the rule of law when it comes to court orders, whether they be federal or state. So I think that there are certainly state actions, just as there are federal actions, that we depend on people saying, okay, a court has ruled and I will follow the law. And I do think that there are real concerns about whether that is going to hold. I will say, just from personal experience, I used to be a litigator at Planned Parenthood. I did a lot of abortion rights litigation. And one of the things that I spent a lot of time on was a series of cases in Texas with what was called SB 8, it's the bounty hunter abortion ban that was kind of a precursor to the fall of Roe. And what I saw in that scenario was a very blatant state attempt to take what was then an established federal right and undermine it in a way that just defied federal law. And that the U.S. Supreme Court signed off on that in that instance, but I think that kind of dynamic of just saying, we understand what the law is, and we are just going to defy it, is something that I am quite concerned about, and could see state courts, state legislators playing either a positive or negative role in.
Echoing that, one of the I have two concerns that I think sort of trend towards anti-democratic, putting aside what democracy means, which is that states not implementing federal law. I'm thinking particularly environmental law. So Trump doesn't get what he wants on the environmental deregulatory sphere. That doesn't stop a state from simply not implementing the federal law on the ground. The state is the one that implements the Clean Water Act often, not the federal EPA. And so if the federal EPA is uninterested in doing it, even if a federal court says you have to regulate, that doesn't stop a state agency from just throwing up its hands and saying no, or dragging its feet, which is why I think it's really important that we have the ability to monitor state agencies and find out what they're doing. So I think that's one of my concerns for anti-democratic, not actually implementing federal law. And this goes both ways. If there's a new statute that is passed and it's upheld as constitutional, I think it's anti-democratic to not implement it in the way that sort of a directive been given. The second one is a knee-jerk reaction, this goes to Rick's point, for state attorneys general to sort of, as soon as they see something, to challenge it. Now, I did multi-state environmental litigation at a state AG's office, and I think most of the time the state AGs are thoughtful as to what impacts their state, what laws are being broken. So I don't want to suggest that the state AG is getting involved is always going to be there, but I think a knee-jerk reaction to always challenging federal law has a tendency to lean towards anti-democratic in the same way of not implementing federal law. So those are sort of my two concerns.
Rick and Dan, and then we'll open it up. Yeah.
So I like all the comments because I feel like I'm just sort of I'm trying to square two tendencies, right? So one is Dan's tendency, and I would say I can even go more academic than Dan on democratic theory, and I will a little bit, right? Because so one strand of power, right? How we define power, right? So is sort of the idea that there's sort of three faces of power. The first face of power is just the obvious one, right? So electoral power is whoever has the vote, they win, and if you're the majority, then you have power. The second phase of power, however, is called agenda setting, and that means that how you actually control whether the issue gets framed, right, like in a ballot initiative, or how you control how it gets through, more practical, a hearing, or whether it goes through a process. Like, that's real power. It's the power of controlling what actually even gets voted on, or agenda, or who votes on it. That's the sort of second phase of power. There's a third phase that's about ideology, but we won't touch that right now. So my general sense with the phases of power in democracy is my inclination is to prefer, and I think one of the features of the U.S. American system is that it's harder to agenda set. It's harder to essentially for one person or one body to say, these are the only decisions being made and these are the only people making it. Because there's so many different avenues and vectors that you can go, right? So federal courts are foreclosed, we got state courts, right? Federal policy no good, we got a bunch of a state legislature. State legislature no good, we got a bunch of city council members. Like, if you want your issue to have a shot, there are so many opportunities and forms in the U.S. system that allows that. So in my sense, democracy means having those venues be available, okay? So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I feel like we're actually in that moment, right? The frustration we're feeling as a country is that too many things are foreclosed. None of our decisions really make a matter. And it's towards the inclination is to smash everything, right? So how do I square, in some ways, my thinking, which is I want a system in which there's lots of opportunities available so that you're not foreclosed, but not go so far as to say that we're not going to have a formal process or a rule of law or some, right, to essentially go into pure anarchy. So I would, like, just even from this conversation, I feel like I'm trying to square the two. So I just thought it was sort of an interesting observation. I don't know if you guys can help me answer that question.
I'll just be really brief. The observation I was making as both Julie and Tony were talking was the way in which I am not sure. I mean, so I don't want to go too far on down this line, but I'm not sure actually, although we all would raise our thumbs to say we like democracy, I think most of us don't mean it in the following way. I think if you're committed to the rule of law, you're committed to a lag on democratic decision making. You're committed to constraints on democratic decision making. Like, if you like James Madison, you don't like democracy. That guy did not like democracy. It was the whole point. He hated democracy, right? He wanted as little of it as possible to still be able to justify it as the will of the people, right? And so I think that when we talk about the rule of law in this country, we're frequently talking about drags on democratic decision-making, which maybe we would argue makes space for a kind of, broadly speaking, democratic culture to develop where we can make decisions, but it's barriers and boundaries and drags. And so if we're worried about states not implementing federal law, I can make an argument to you that that's extremely democratic. And the problem is not that it's anti-democratic that states not do that. It's rather chaotic or wrong or anarchic, right? But actually, democracy can be chaotic and wrong and anarchic. And so you have to have I just think that democracy is too thin a term to do the work that we're trying to talk about here, which is like, which rules of law do we want to preserve and which rules of law are we willing to resist? And I think that's the work we have to actually do together and find spaces to do together and have those conversations. That's actually, to me, what democracy means, is having those conversations in a rich, thoughtful way, as opposed to just sort of like throwing like, you're wrong, you're anti-democratic, you're anti-democratic, I don't think those actually wind up getting us where we need to go in terms of trying to figure out what we're trying to do together.
Okay, let's open it up to the audience. Deb, do we have a mic or, great. Deb has a mic. I'm not afraid to cold call, but I'll only cold call students. Please.
Over the summer, I read a book called Laboratories Against Democracy, which argued that this whole experimentation idea, while it was like really interesting in what the founding fathers wanted and cool to think about, in a modern era, it just didn't really work. People were too polarized, races were too nationalized. I was just wondering what you guys thought about that.
I can take that, or at least start us off. I mean, yes and no, and yes in the sense that things are polarized. It's hard to get to a consensus. One state does one thing, they use it as political fodder, it gets into the national consensus. On the other end, states do all sorts of interesting, cool, different things that we can never even imagine possible at the federal level. For one, they often actually legislate, right? That's not something, we don't pass statutes all that often at the federal level anymore, meaningful ones. And so taking away that ability to experiment and find out what works to maybe we can implant it to the national level or implant it in another state, I think is a disservice. I think that's one of the benefits of having 50 states. There maybe should be some baseline of what we think is acceptable for constitutional rights or regulation. But beyond that, I think having the ability to let states be innovative and use their resources and take stock of what their own citizens want and envision for their state, like to construct like a positive vision of law, I think is critically important. So although I'm also of two minds on it, so I worry about the laboratories, but I think, you know, in theory at least, and sometimes in practice too, we get a lot of good out of it.
I think that there is a lot of power in having sort of proof of concept. So, you know, for example, one of the, in state precedent, you see some states that have become, you know, their search and seizure case law has diverged substantially from what the federal case law is in ways that are far more protective. You see some states saying, yeah, we can judge partisan gerrymandering. We can figure out what's too much and what's not enough. You know, states that have equal rights amendments that, you know, some people say, well, if you had that kind of protection, it would end XYZ programs. In each of those examples, if you have a state that has actually done that, it is very difficult for a state court or a for a federal court or federal legislators to say it simply can't be done because you have the proof of concept. It can be done, it has been done, and the sky did not fall. So from my perspective, I think certainly in that area of precedent, I think the laboratories analogy is actually quite helpful. And not just in protecting people's rights at the state level, but potentially driving federal change later down the road.
I think that there's two ways of thinking about this. I think on the one hand, you have this idea of laboratories of democracy where there are things that the federal government or the state government could do, but they delegate to states to try other things, or they delegate to local governments to try other things. But as a local government person, I confess to finding the laboratory idea not very useful because there's just a lot of governing that has to get done. And it's not so much a laboratory to figure out where the stoplights go, right? It's actually like we have to figure out where the stoplights go. And we have to figure out how to run a police department. And we have to figure out how to fund our schools, right? And the states put constraints on those things, but there's a lot of, like, we have to figure out how to decide if you're allowed to build a third floor on your house. Right? Is it Ed in planning who decides? Is it like, do we have a planning board? How do we decide these things? And I think actually the sort of fetishes, like Brandeis's idea of this laboratories where we're actually trying a bunch of things and learning from each other, we're doing a lot of aggressive not learning from each other and a lot of aggressive doing stuff just to see if it works or exigently because we have to do it and it has to get done, right? And so I think that if you think about it that way, it seems a little bit less there are these areas where it's kind of where states are learning from each other and there is a kind of clean information transfer, but there's a lot of chaos, right? Which feels less like laboratory and more like chemical spill, right? And so, and I think that actually describes a lot of American governance is a kind of just do it and nobody's watching and we're not necessarily learning from it, which I'm not sure how that cuts, but I think by describing it that way, you get a slightly different picture, and I think it gives you different ways of thinking about the problem.
So I want to answer that question 3 ways, and you'll understand why. So the first way I want to answer it is to say that, so this claim I think has been always made, right? Like we don't need states, we don't need localities, we live in some sort of, we're all national citizens, heck, we might be all global citizens or something like that. I think those tend to be overstated, and I think actually we're in an interesting moment where to the extent that that has been pushing into higher and higher levels, I feel like what we're in the moment now is actually this retreat back, right, away from some sort of amorphous, global citizenship or something like that, right, just sort of identify some particular local context. So I think that there is an inclination that sort of to pull back in that regard. I also do feel, right, that actually it's not clear given, right, if we're all national citizens and we should all do things nationally, then we would need a functional Congress. And actually, the one institution, and again, we can get into the context of who's the non-functional, but Congress is probably one of the nominees, right? And certainly we imagine that if we're all national citizens, then Congress is, I don't trust that very much, right, with regard to decision making. But the third way I want to respond to that actually goes a little bit to Dan's earlier question of what is democracy. I know, that question has sort of loomed large. And I want to say democracy not just as the way Dan, like trying to decide which policy goes forward or who wins or not, but actually the practice of it, the sense of what that feels like, right? And democracy isn't just the voting. It's even just like, I don't know, for us, like a good faculty meeting, people coming together, making decisions, and feeling like there is, even if we do not agree, some legitimacy to that. I know, okay, that was a bad example. That's the worst example in the history of time, but it happens sometimes, okay? But the reason I say that is because I think a lot of democracy actually requires context. It requires a shared context. It requires an idea that in which we recognize this place as our own, that we have some shared values, or that we recognize each other as people. And I feel like while a lot of the resistance, I think, right now against our political system is we talk a lot about democracy in terms of whether votes are in a Dropbox or votes are in whatever, but we don't talk a lot about democracy in terms of people interacting with one another in a shared context, understanding and then sort of having some sort of commitment to that. So I feel like at the end of the day, yeah, maybe we can make all decisions at the national level. Maybe that's where it should be. Maybe, heck, we can just make it all the international level. But I think as humans, unless we get completely absorbed into the metaverse, like true democracy is going to be looking your neighbors in the eye and saying that we're going to make a decision collectively, and that decision is going to affect all of us. And I may not agree with it, but I respect you and you respect me. That, I think, is a goal, and that, I think, requires some context, and that means it requires some decentralization. It may not be the state, but I think it requires something bigger than the national. And small.
Great. Will in front.
So I want to push on this point of maybe democracy as like a term of art that doesn't really mean much. I think what was, I think we just tried to define it there, but I think what was so fascinating about this recent presidential election is both sides were essentially like vote for us because if we lose democracy as we know it is just gone forever. So we're kind of in this like Tower of Babel moment where we can't even like agree on what democracy means even though we're supposedly in a democracy. So to bring it back to the state issue, do you think there's room for states to kind of experiment with what democracy actually means in their own eyes? Or is that tenable, or could it be tenable in the sense that we can kind of have like the Portland, California far left experimentation, and then maybe the majority will kind of say like, no, we don't want that anymore. So which way do you think it could go?
So I'll bring it back to practical examples. I think, if you look at state constitutions, they have far more provisions about process, legislative process, elections, far beyond what the federal Constitution has. So one example that we've worked on is many states, I don't know if Connecticut is one of them, have single subject rules that apply not just to ballot initiatives, but actually to legislation. And it is a check on state legislators that if they are going to pass any kind of legislation, it can only deal with a single subject at a time. And the purpose of that is to avoid log rolling, to avoid, this idea that people are voting on things that they don't really know about, or they like half of it, but they hate the other half. So I think that there is a role for states, and I think that state constitutions show that states already play that role in terms of trying different mechanisms, adding more guardrails to the democratic process in a way that we simply don't see at the federal level.
Another great place to see this is in the way states organize local governments. So every state has rules. I mean, the New England states are more complicated because the towns are town by town by town. There's no unincorporated land. So if you're from New England, you don't know what unincorporated land is. But if you're not from New England, you know that a lot of the land in this country is governed by counties, not by any towns. But states have different rules about who gets to vote to incorporate unincorporated land. They have different rules about who gets to vote when one place is trying to secede from another place. They have different rules about, you can choose, do you want to have a town, a city manager? Do you want to have a strong mayor? And those are guardrails set by states. And in fact, there's a huge amount of variation and experimentation. For instance, Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live, has ranked choice voting. And ranked choice voting is democracy, but it works completely differently from first past the post voting and has completely different outcomes. So if you use a ranked choice voting mechanism, you get really different answers to the question of what people prefer, and you get different legislatures, right? So there's a ton of room for. Cambridge also voted to have non-citizen voting. The state of Massachusetts doesn't let Cambridge make that decision, so we don't yet have non-citizen voting. But in some states, non-citizen voting in local elections is allowed, right? There's a huge amount of flexibility that the states have in terms of literally trying different forms of democracy, letting 15-year-olds vote. Right? There's a huge amount of freedom that states actually have in terms of adjusting the boundaries and trying these things, and not just that they have in theory, but that they actually use. And so if you look city by city, county by county, dog catcher by dog catcher, you get really different answers to who's voting for what and how those democracies are working.
I do think, and I mentioned a little bit earlier before, that even the sort of, right, it's easy to say, if you vote for the other president in the national election, then there's sort of no more democracy. And I think a lot of that is talking about the particular policies or choices. But in talking about the mechanisms, it's sort of interesting. I mean, I feel like in some ways, because we are so heavily decentralized, because states are sovereign, because we have a system that relies so much on states, I mean, as much as the federal government is powerful, their workforce, their actual presence is actually really light compared to the amount of state and local officials. Like, we talk about rigging elections. Look, the fact that we haven't actually really got into election rigging in this country is not because people haven't tried. It's because we have an election system, and again, I know people hate this, that's run by essentially a bunch of little boards in every single town, staffed by volunteer, retirees. And it's really hard to get them all to rig every one of them and tell them to keep a secret. Like, it just doesn't work. It's just really hard. Like, if it's run by, federal election, blah, 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 yeah, we can rig that thing pretty easily, right? But it was a bunch of, really nice old grandmas running it. It's really just hard to keep them a secret, right? Like, no, we're rigging this one. Just don't tell your grandkids on this one, right? So, strangely enough, it's these weird mechanisms that we complain about, the inefficiencies, the amateurism, all that strangely enough maybe why that comment is not wrong. It's not because I don't think that, as our founding fathers worried, that these people at top, right, would not want to be able to execute it if they could. It's because actually, at least the baseline that we start with is just so decentralized that the quote-unquote most powerful position in the country, actually at the end of the day, not clear that it's that powerful, right? Not to say they're not powerful, they're super powerful. But because there's all these other roadblocks that are put in.
Let's do one more question from the audience to close us out. Ian. In back. Oh, can you raise your hand again?
No pressure. So I want to go back to what Julie said a few minutes ago about the rule of law and how it requires that at some point people say, well, this is the law and I'm going to follow it, and I think the implication is even if I don't agree with it. And I was thinking about that, and it only works up to a point. You know, if the incoming administration were to get every single law on their wish list passed, not that I think they will, but if they did, there'd be some that I just disagree with as a policy matter, and there would be some that I would disagree with on a really deep, moral, visceral level, to the point where I'm not sure how far my commitment to the rule of law would actually go. And I know that's also true for people on the other side of the political spectrum, that there's things that they are deeply morally opposed to, and that's where I think a lot of the political tension in this country comes from. So to bring it back to the state issue, if you really do have these divisions that are not just policy, that are not just politics, but are really deep-seated beliefs where defiance is kind of a moral imperative from a certain point of view, and those impetuses vary so much from state to state and even within the same state, where does that leave us?
1850 analogy, right? So,
I'll start off real quickly, because I think it connects three strands I've been sort of rotating here. I think rule of law is important, but as you notice, right, rule of law doesn't really do anything if it's not legitimate, right? And I feel like then we're talking about how is the rule of law legitimate, or how is the law legitimate, or how is a rule seen as legitimate, or how is a rule that even people that don't agree with see as legitimate. And there may be many answers to that question, but one of them is democracy, right? Or at least not democracy in some sort of process, but some feeling that this is part of a process in which we sign up for. And I feel like to the extent that I think there's a lot of talk about rule of law and formal process, but in some ways maybe we don't have enough conversation about essentially what is it that we are doing and the decisions they're making that makes a rule seem legitimate or illegitimate. I don't think actually necessarily that makes necessarily what states do or localities do more legitimate or less legitimate. But I think what it does is I think it switches the question to not just can we win, but how you win, right? I mean, I don't want to go, I'll say this because this sort of got me thinking, right? Like this is sort of one of the sayings when sort of Gandhi was talking about social movements and essentially how you effectuate change, and he uses the essentially a parable of a person getting a house, and he says, I can tell 5 different stories of how this person got a house. We can just focus on the fact that he got a house. But whether he got the house because of his good deeds or he worked hard and he bought it, or whether he killed the owners and stole it, like all that matters to what the house means. So I think in some ways the process of it, not just who wins at the end, is equally important. And again, it goes back to legitimacy and rule of law. And I don't know at the moment where anyone's focusing on that, right? Because what we're focusing on is essentially the rule at the end of the day, whoever gets to write it.
I think we have to have a deep commitment to the process and the idea that if things are passed normally through proper channels, that we've accepted the outcome of that legislation that or the election. And I think if you're concerned about particular issues, I'm with Dan, go to the local level at that point, right? If you need to have the conversations with your neighbors about those things that you morally, viscerally disagree about, while accepting the outcomes of elections, the processes that made them come about, and the legitimacy of the processes and rules. And I think the best place to do that, given the vitriol at the national level, is in the local government, in that town hall meeting, in combination with where to cite the stoplights, who do we think is part of our community and why, and look the neighbors in the faces when you have those conversations.
I was debating about whether to go to the 1850s, but I will. I guess what this question raises is when is it legitimate to view improperly passed laws as illegitimate, right? And I do think it's about processes and about systems, but I tend to think that we have been too meek and accepting of the processes that we live with. So for instance, the Senate is garbage. The Senate was a compromise that nobody thought was a good compromise in 1787. They knew it was a bad compromise. And they did it on the basis of some idea that states were sovereign, but actually it was just about Rhode Island extracting things from New York, right? But we live with the Senate, and we have actually come up with all the, if you say the Senate is garbage to somebody, they will come up with some of you are doing it right now. Well, no, I can defend it. It's indefensible, right? Well, we can talk about it later if you want. I think it's indefensible, but we live with it as a kind of like, it's a status quo thing, right? And so the processes that we are willing, the processes matter because I don't see Brett Kavanaugh as legitimate because he was passed through a process. It's legitimate in name, but to me, it doesn't correspond with the way that I understand how democracy ought to operate, right? And so I actually think that it's important that we be willing to not just say, and yes, the Constitution is good because it's been coded as good. My colleague Aziz Rana has written a book that basically shows how the Constitution, the idea that the Constitution is good is an invention of the mid-20th century. And in fact, there's a long tradition in this country of people saying the Constitution is garbage and we should make a new one. Right? But as long as we feel like we are constrained to obey the laws according to the mechanisms that they were passed, we are actually creating a kind of like guardrails for ourselves that maybe don't need to be there. And that's where you get to the 1850s. The moderates in the 1850s said we have to have the compromise with slavery because it was passed through legitimate means under our current political order. And the critics of it said, those processes are themselves illegitimate. They didn't say we should have anarchy, but they said we should create new processes to create outcomes that we think are better, that are more legitimate, that we can live with. We can live with disagreeing, but we can't live with being told that we must agree with something that emerged from a process that we find anathema, right? And so I think the goal of building democracy is building a space where we can have dissensus, disagreement, but we actually all agree on the baseline mechanism of coming to some kind of agreement. And I don't think that we have that right now at the national level. I don't think we have it in many states. If you think about the places in your life where you actually can disagree and lose happily, it's in smaller knit communities where there are systems of trust and processes that you have some buy-in into. So that's why I'm a localist. I don't think we have that in local governments now, but I think we could. If there's one place where we could build that kind of process that's dynamic and changing, where we can agree and also disagree and not have fights about legitimacy, I don't think our constitutional system is it. I don't think many state constitutional systems are it, but we might be able to build it at the local level. Maybe not, but we might be able to.
Julie, do you want to land the plane for us? Maybe speak in favor of the rule of law in a more traditional way.
So I will.
You speak from your heart. Speak from your heart.
I will say this. I think that, my comments earlier certainly were not intended to suggest that there's not a role for civil disobedience, for protest, for principled refusals to implement laws and resignations in some cases over those refusals. But I do think that there is, just setting aside the theory, our legal system operates on the idea that when a court issues an order, there are processes. You can appeal it. You can go up to the state Supreme Court. You can go to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the sort of underlying assumption is that people are going to follow court orders. And, we are already seeing, like in Ohio, they've had back and forth, the state Supreme Court issuing orders and the legislature just willfully defying it. That kind of dynamic, it seems to me, it does pose the question of like, the alternative is anarchy. And from my perspective, certainly individuals and the general public have a right to protest, have a right to civil disobedience, and there is a really important historical place for that. But I also think on a practical level, when it comes to individuals who are government officials who are swearing to uphold the Constitution and law, the kind of willful defiance, not just of an individual, but an entire body of government, I think is quite problematic and, is something that we're going to have to continue to wrestle with, perhaps to a far greater degree in the coming 4 years.
Wonderful. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you for your great questions.